So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We will continue reading Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart. We have already had one session on the novel already, and we'll just pick up from where we left off last time. So if you remember, just to give you a very quick recap of what you've done so far, we're looking at this novel by Achebe as a rewriting of history, true fabulation, true fiction, but at the same time, it is also some kind of a positioning. It is also fashioning a certain kind of tragedy, right? Positioning a certain kind of tragedy, because the positionality of tragedy is important. Because if you just remember the Heart of Darkness story by Conrad, the entire tragedy, the entire tragic impetus, the entire tragic weight is located in the white person, the white subject, the white male subject, right? Everyone else outside the white male subjectivity territory is denied any tragic essence, is denied any tragic identity, right? So the positionality and the fashioning of tragedy is also important over here, because then who gets to be the tragic subject? That becomes an important question. Who gets to tell the tragic tale? Who gets to inhabit and embody tragedy? These questions become really important in any fashioning of tragedy. So, in that sense, the Achebe novel is a refashioning of the post-colonial tragedy. So, this is on your screen, and obviously, we're reading Begum's essay. Uh, Things Fall Apart is concerned not only with the writing history, but also with fashioning history. Achebe himself made this point in an interview with Robert Serumaga, in which he had discussed the political implications of tragedy and explicitly referred to his novel as an example of that genre, right? As a political tragedy, right? A post-colonial tragedy or a refashioned tragedy. Uh, and if you remember again, when we started off reading this essay, the main intellectual impetus of the essay is to locate the ending, the idea of the non-straightforward ending of Achebe's novel, despite its superficial straightforwardness, where the protagonist dies. This essay is trying to probe into the many possibilities with which the novel's ending may be discussed. A good deal of the critical literature has focused on this issue, addressing the question of whether a novel is indeed a tragedy, and if so, what kind of tragedy. Thus, Bruce MacDonald and Margaret Turner maintain that Things Fall Apart fails as an Aristotelian tragedy. So we discussed this earlier, how this fails as Aristotelian tragedy, how it is a modern tragedy, and how it can be seen as a tragedy of the Igbo community, and so on and so forth. And of course, as you can see on the screen, Abiola Ireel considers this more generally as an instance of cultural and historical tragedy. Now, this what Begum is arguing over here, that the reason why there's so many differences in terms of addressing the kind of tragedy it is because most criticism, most scholarship has failed to recognize the multiplicity in Achebe's novel, which is why the straightforward ending is celebrated as something very innocuous and very closure-driven, whereas the ending, if one may read it deeply, is something more problematic in that sense, right? So, and as Begum goes on to say that according to the model that I shall develop, nationalist history is associated with classical or Aristotelian tragedy. Adversarial history is associated with modern or ironic tragedy. So there are two different kinds of tragedy that are defined, and meta history is associated with critical discourse. So, very, very broadly speaking, these are three engines of tragic writing or tragedy writing or textualizing tragedy, if you will, which are operative. So the Aristotelian tragedy is more involved with nationalist history, history of the status quo, or classical history, what is orientation and continuity in terms of space and time and identity. Whereas when you have an adversarial tragedy written from the other perspective, then it is more ironic in quality, where the fault lines, the incompletions, the interruptions, these are foregrounded and sometimes celebrated. And of course, we have the meta history idea of tragedy, which is associated with a critical discourse, as in it is critiquing the own process of history writing, as it were, by laying bare the mechanism which is involved in the history writing process. So, my larger purpose in pursuing this line of analysis is to suggest that Things Fall Apart demands what is, in effect, a palimpsestic reading, so multi layered reading, palimpsestic reading, a kind of historical and generic archaeology which is designed to uncover layer by layer those experiences that have accreted around colonialism and its protracted aftermath. So both during colonialism and the legacies, the post-colonial moment, the aftermath of colonialism, right? Which is why the layer by layer quality is important, because it requires various kinds of unpacking, various kinds of uncovering, right? Which is why this particular essay is a challenge to the standard scholarship on Things Fall Apart, right? So it reads the novel as a multi-layered novel, and it sort of brings into conflict a sort of a triangulated conflict between Aristotelian tragedy, adversarial tragedy, and meta history, right? So all these different processes of history writing are brought into a very, very productive paradox apropos of each other. So the first of the novel's three endings centers on Okonoku's killing of the messenger, his failed attempt to rouse his people to action, and his subsequent suicide. This ending presents the events of the novel largely from an African perspective, equating Okonku's demise with the collapse of Igbo culture. So it's quite allegorical. So the demise of Okonku is also the end of the Igbo culture. So he becomes some kind of allegorical embodiment of that culture per se. The idea that Okonku is a great man whose destiny is linked with that of his people is immediately established in the novel's celebrated opening, and this is the opening of the novel. Okonku was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond. His fame rested on solid personal achievements. As a young man of 18, he had brought honor to his village by throwing Amelins the cat. Amelins was a great wrestler who for 7 years was unbeaten from Umumifia to Meino. He was called the cat because his back would never touch the earth. It was this man that Okonku threw in a fight in which the old men agreed was one of the fiercest since the founder of the town engaged the spirit of the wild for 7 days and 7 nights. So again, look at the very interesting juxtaposition of historical, topical description with fabulation, with apocryphal descriptions, and with embellishments, and with different kinds of hyperbolic representation. So different orders of space-time, different orders of measurement, different orders of scale are juxtaposed together, sometimes compared, sometimes contrasted, sometimes calibrated together, right? Now, Okonku is described through his, physical prowess, the fact that he could defeat the earlier champion who hadn't been defeated for the longest time. And you can see the digressive method, or the almost metaleptic method, through which different kinds of characterizations are happening, different kinds of emplotment are taking place. And as it is very, very evident in this passage, history recedes into myth, as the narrator presents the 7-year reign of Amelins and a 7-day struggle of the founder of the village in epic terms. So again, notice how the vocabulary juxtaposes the novelistic tradition as well as the earlier pre-novelistic tradition, in this case the epic tradition. So we discussed something similar when we're reading Arkin Narayan's Guide. So how it is very heavily plucked into the real and the now in terms of the novelistic tradition, but at the same time it is also sort of recreating or reconstructing and recycling definitely some of the mythical structures or the mythical vocabulary that Narayan is obviously well aware of, corresponding to the Hindu-Indian myths, right? So that juxtaposition is very, very important for us to recognize. The passage also serves both to connect Okonku with the beginnings of Umofia. Through his wrestling exploits, he is compared with the village's symbolic progenitor. So the Genesis story is subverted, and Okonku becomes the new Genesis embodiment. And to look forward to his own and his people's end, the spirit of the wild, representing nature, will be replaced by the more powerful alien force of British imperialism. So again, the mutability and cyclicity of power. So how the spirit of the wild, which is now the most powerful spirit, will be replaced, will be supplanted, will be erased by the engines of imperialism, which will come in very, very soon. So in a few deft strokes, Achebe illustrates how Okonku has come to personify the destiny of his community, extending from his earliest origins to its final destruction, right? So again, the sense of finality is important over here. And of course, the finality is connects both individual and the community together. So almost an apocalyptic qualities there at the beginning, in terms of how Okungku is represented, described through his village, through his community, which is also to suggest that the death of Okungku or the demise of Okungku, the end of Okungku, will also indicate the end of an era, the end of a space-time, the end of a community consciousness, as it were. So the larger effect of Achebe's opening is to establish Okungku as a particular kind of tragic protagonist, the great warrior who carries with him the fate of his people. Seen from the standpoint of the first ending, he is, as Michael Valls Moses has argued, a Homeric hero cast in a distinctly Acheulean mold. So again, notice how the European tradition, the Western traditions of characterizing the hero, of creating the character of the hero, are still present. It's possible to read Okungku from those lenses, while at the same time he's obviously someone who's subverting those lenses. He's subverting through his physical embodiment as well as his persona and the kind of community representation he's doing. He's subverting and rewriting that fashioning of the hero, right? And we can see how this kind of fashioning may be seen. And this is a quotation by Michael Valls. Like Achilles, Okungku is a man of action, a man of war. His fame among the Igbo rests on solid personal achievements, foremost of which are his exploits as the greatest wrestler and most accomplished warrior of the 9 villages. He is a man renowned and respected for having brought home the battle 5 human heads, and on feast days and important public occasions he drinks his palm wine from the skull of the first warrior he killed. So, I mean, these are the kind of markers of masculinity, virile, military, and a powerful masculinity that is obviously corresponds to the community, the identity of the community. And Okungku, as a hero of the community, as the most powerful man of the community, is described using certain strategic markers. So again, we can see how the text and the context are connected with each other, because when we talk about novel and change, it's important to also study characters. And we saw how Raju's character in Arkin and Ryan's novel is symbolic of the different kinds of changes in the ecosystem, the moral, financial, cultural ecosystem around him. And his transition is reflective of that changing ecosystems. In that sense, it becomes a classic novel and change paradigm. Now, here too, we have a similar situation. So, Okungku is, in other words, identified with his community to the extent that it esteems the martial ethos he embodies. And while his village certainly does more than make war, it especially prizes those men who win distinction on the battlefield. So in Umuofia, men were bold and warlike. This is not to say, however, that Okungku epitomizes all the virtues of Igbo culture, or that he is himself without fault. So he's a flawed hero. In other words, he is not someone who is elevated to a deified position. So that human-like quality with Okungku, those of you who read the novel would know, is exactly what makes him so memorable in quality. So Achebe, on the contrary, himself understands that within an Aristotelian framework, his hero is necessarily a flawed character, guilty of errors in judgment, guilty, to use the Greek term, of hamartia. So hamartia is a fatal error in judgment, which contributes to the hero's downfall. So we see that happen in many novels, how novels which still use the sort of Greek tragic vocabulary often uses tropes of hamartia, peripetia, change in fortune, and of course, the decline of the hero happens because of that, right? Hubris is another example of vanity, false pride, which causes the error of judgment. As Achebe has observed in an interview with Charles Rowell, the tragic protagonist is a man who is larger than life, who exemplifies virtues that are admired by the community, but also a man who, for all that, is still human. He can have flaws, you see, but all that seems to be very elegantly underlined in Aristotle's work. Obviously, Okungku is larger than life. He was tall and huge, and his bushy eyebrows and wide nose gave him a very severe look. Yet his epic proportions carry a figurative as well as a literal significance. So the larger than life character of Okungku, the physical dimensionality of Okungku also carries within him, the allegorical dimension, the fact that he represents the community which is flourishing and big and expansive. So his fall in the end, his death and demise in the end, is also a very, very heavy death. of the entire community. It's the end of an era, so to speak. So it's important to make him larger than life, both in terms of his valor, character, as well as his sheer physical presence. So they indicate the difficulty he experiences fitting within the boundaries of any social order. So it is that as a man of action, a great athlete and warrior, he is excessive both in his high-spiritedness, what the Greeks call thymos. So whenever he was angry, he could not get his words out quickly enough. He would use his fists. So again, a very physical way to describe him. And it is prideful arrogance, what the Greeks call hybris. So again, vanity or false pride. The oldest man present said sternly to Okonkwo that those whose palm kernels were cracked for them by a benevolent spirit should not forget to be humble, right? So the lack of humility is a problem that Okonkwo has. Of course, all these character flaws, which are interestingly and ironically very, very similar and comparable to the Greek characters, are what makes Okonkwo very memorable as a human character. Indeed, like many of the heroes of classical tragedy, Okonkwo's immoderate behavior consistently places him at cross purposes, not merely with his fellow Omopheians, but with the gods themselves. So Okonkwo was not the man to stop beating somebody halfway through, not even for fear of a goddess. And it comes as no surprise when, in the second part of the novel, he is sent into temporary exile for offending Anu, the earth deity, right? So we can see how anger, lack of humility, arrogance, so all these characters, all these qualities are also part of Okonkwo's character, right? And that is what makes him really interesting, the largeness of him, the bigness of him, and also the sort of the fatality about him, the fact that he's someone who seems to be doomed already for destruction. So all these come together and make him a really round character. And one has to remember that he is representing a culture, so he should not be just an allegorical function. So the flawed qualities of Okonkwo also correspond to the flawed qualities of the Igbo culture in many sense. So nevertheless, if we are to appreciate the tragedy of the first ending, something that Achebe clearly intends, then we must recognize that Okonkwo's faults are essentially virtues carried to an extreme, and that while he's obviously not perfect, he nevertheless represents some of the best qualities of his culture. As Obereka remarks near the novel's end, that man was one of the greatest men in Omofia, right? So again, the heroic quality of Okonkwo is also quite Hellenic in the sense that, even his flaws are representative of his culture. Even his flawed quality makes him, someone more memorable and great. So his greatness not only depends on his nobility or his goodness, but also his flawed quality, also his fatal flaws in many sense. So in that way, the novel becomes a really interesting piece of imagination. And even if we read the novel psychologically, you find that Okonkwo is a very psychologically complex character, but also being a function, some kind of social, cultural, political impetus at that point of time. So the crisis of the novel. So every novel has a series of crises, and in this particular novel, obviously, it has a political, geopolitical, cultural, psychological, different palimpsestic layers of crisis, which are there. So the crisis of the novel comes in the penultimate chapter when an impudent messenger sent by the colonial authorities orders a tribal meeting to disband. Okonkwo the warrior is moved to action. In a flash, Okonkwo drew his machete. The messenger crouched to avoid the blow. It was useless. Okonkwo's machete descended twice, and the man's head lay beside his uniformed body. So the act of beheading that happens over here is obviously quite clinical. At the same time, it is a very spectacular depiction of Okonkwo's prowess and strength and valor. So the waiting back cloth jumped into tumultuous life, and the meeting was stopped. Okonkwo stood looking at the dead man. He knew that Omofia would not go to war. He knew because they had let the other messengers escape. They had broken in the tumult instead of action. He discerned fright in the tumult. He heard voices asking, why did he do it? He wiped his machete on the sand and went away. So the silence over here is important because there is this commotion, the chaos, the murmur, which is getting generated, which is also an indication of the disbelief and the misgivings of his community. And Okonkwo stands as a lone man over here. The certain but lone man who is certain of his action, is certain of the rightness of his action, and he walks away in silence as well. So that becomes a very symbolic departure, which is also a moment of crisis. And that it happens to a lot of heroes in novels and cinema, and you find that it's a very old trope, the isolation, the increased isolation of the protagonist, who is about to become a hero or who has become a hero and whose life is about to end. So that sense of isolation is also part of his individuality or uniqueness per se. The scene is represented or presented with a devastating simplicity. From the perspective of this first ending, the people of Umofia have deserted Okonkwo and in the process betrayed themselves. But the wiping of the machete is the only eloquence he permits himself. It is an ordinary and everyday gesture, yet in the present context it acquires special significance. Okonkwo remains true to the martial ethics that his people have abandoned, here represented by the various care of his weapon. At the same time, he symbolically dissolves his connection with his people, wiping away the blood bond that has joined them. So this is a really brilliant reading, as you can see. So the simple act of wiping away the blood from the machete can be read in so many ways. So one reading, obviously, is he stands true to his character. He stands as a pure military man who is refusing to give in to the confusion and the misgivings of his community. That is one reading, which makes him a pure noble hero of the military kind. The second reading is just the opposite of that. In dissolving the connection with people, he's doing that by wiping away the blood bond, the kinship system that had earlier connected them together. So when he wipes it away from his machete, he becomes someone who's abandoned by the community, right? So both readings are equally valid and equally accommodated in this palimpsestic post-colonial reading that we are doing with the novel. So this gesture is especially resonant because, as critics have pointed out, in killing the messenger, he is shedding the blood of a fellow Igbo, right? So this becomes almost an act of sin, and he sheds the blood of the fellow Igbo, and then obviously the wiping away of blood from this machete also becomes some kind of a rejection of the kinship structure. So the suicide that follows is itself a profound violation of the Igbo law, which strictly prohibits acts of self-destruction, right? So suicide is a big taboo in this culture, the Igbo culture, which forbids it in no unclear terms, and yet, that becomes a very important part of the novel, which is also to say how the act of suicide is a further rejection of the Igbo legal system, the Igbo community kinship system. The question of how we should respond to Okonkwo's final deed has been examined in detail by Kali Ogba and Damian Opata, but with strikingly different results. So one of the really fun things about this essay is how it brings together absolutely different readings of the novel, and it puts them all together, juxtaposes them all together to show that, well, they are different from each other. They sort of undercut each other, but the novel's greatness is such that it can all be accommodated and they can all be valid at different points of time. So for Ogba, the suicide grows out of Okonkwo's failure to act with sufficient piety towards the Igbo gods and traditions. So that's one way of looking at it, as a guilt, which grows out of his failure to be respectful to the Igbo gods and traditions. While for the other reading by Damian Opata, it's a consequence of the Igbo's refusal to rally around Okonkwo and join him in resisting the British. So there are different readings. One is Okonkwo kills himself out of guilt because he feels he's let the Igbo community down. The other could be this is an act of isolation and absolute extreme loneliness because Igbos refuse to rally around Okonkwo and join him in the resistance against the British. Right, so both readings are equally valid. As was the case with discussions on the novel's tragedy, the disagreement arises in the first place because the reader has difficulty establishing Achebe's position on a number of issues, difficulty knowing, for example, where he stands on a question of violent resistance to the British. So again, Achebe's own authorial position here is important because he is someone who is obviously is unclear in terms of where he stands in the act of violent disagreements, of violent resistance against the British. Is he advocating, is it pro-violence in terms of resistance, or does he want a more diplomatic relationship? So that is never quite clear. So one can obviously maintain an ambivalence around Okunku's death over here. Of course, this interpretative problem is largely disappears once you begin to read the novel palimpsestically as a layering of diverse perspectives on history and tragedy. Now, once you establish a palimpsestic model, then all these seemingly contradictory readings can become equally valid instead of undercutting each other. Hence, understood within the terms of the novel's first ending, Okunku's suicide is a logical and necessary consequence of an idealistic and absolutist position. Both nationalist history and heroic tragedy demand that he remain unyielding and that the Igbos honor the cultural heritage by refusing assimilation. Even in his final gesture, then, Okunku functions as a true representative of his people. For he sees it, as he sees it, Igbo culture has willingly succumbed to its own annihilation, committing what is a form of collective suicide by submitting to the British. In taking his own life, Okunku has simply preceded his people in the communal destruction. Once again, he has led the way. So this is again a very interesting reading. So the act of suicide here, the act of killing himself over here, is also seen as an act of leadership because it's a premonition of the symbolic suicide that the community creates when they refuse to resist the British. So this sort of anticipates or becomes a very prophetic act because it anticipates the complete erasure of identity that the Igbo community is about to experience, right? So the annihilation, the self-annihilation of Okunku is also an indicator of the imminent annihilation of the Igbo community because it is resisting, it is not resisting the British imperialism. So in one reading, this is an absolute rejection of the Igbo community because it is going against the ethos of preservation and the ethos against self-destruction. So Okunku's suicide is a blatant, refusal or the blatant rejection of the Igbo community's injunction against suicide. He blatantly disregards it and kills himself. That's one reading. The second reading is, he is someone as a leader. He just kills himself because he realizes it's just a matter of time that his entire community gets psychologically killed. It completely, his identity is erased away in no unclear terms, right? So that in that he becomes to he begins to anticipate what is to come, and he becomes sort of the seer, someone who gets there first, someone who leads the way, the leader, as it were. So we'll stop at this point today, but we can see how the novel does two things primarily in very interesting ways. That one is it gives you an allegorical structure in terms of how the society is changing, how the geopolitics, the change in geopolitics is also changing different kinds of identity formations, societal formations, landscape formations, and different kinds of demographic formations. But at the same time, it's also a very subjective psychological novel, which talks about a person and his psyche, the trials and tribulations, emotional and moral ambivalence and ambiguity that a person goes through, the protagonist goes through. So it's both quite psychological and very, very political, which is why it's one of the really important novels to read in a course like this. And of course, in its own right, it's one of the most famous novels written in the 20th century, Things Fall Apart. And in many sense, this could be said as one of the first examples of a proper post-colonial novel because it talks about the colonial movement and what it does, the level of economic corruption, the level of physical corruption and abuse, but also very importantly the level of psychological corruption, how the psyche of a community is absolutely decimated. And the erasure over here is not just a physical erasure of people dying, but also the erasure and the denial of a community's history, a community's identity, a community's starting story. So the stories are taken away, the identities are taken away, and what we get instead is an implantation, a cohesive implantation of a new identity iteration, which is the imperial identity, right? So we can see how different forms of cohesion, physiological, physical, psychological, emotional, visceral, military, financial, all different forms of cohesion and territorialization are taking place over here. And Okunku, as a character, he's constantly navigating across different kinds of, domination, different kinds of tyranny, and his eventual suicide becomes an act of liberation in some sense. It's one reading that's the only resistance left for him at that point in time, which also anticipates, as the reading does over here, the eventual and imminent death of the Igbo community, right? So the community, identity, and politics all get triangulated together in very, very complex ways in the novel. So we'll stop at this point today and we'll continue with this reading in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.